Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you happen stand to this Truth Bomb riff, I think I'm up to like 687, maybe 690. And I'm joined once again by my friend, my compadre, my comrade up in the Great White North. It's not quite so white up there, it looks like behind the scenes. But my friend, Regan Boychuck, an amazing human being, a fantastic journalist, and I'll include some of his links down below in the description, but somebody who's a working man as well, has got a lot on his plate and a lot of things going on. And we're recording this on Sunday, November 9th, approximately noon on Eastern time. And boy, Reagan, a lot going on, right? I mean, first and foremost, I want to address really a lot of what information you provide to me on a pretty much an ongoing basis. That's just mind-boggling. Your level of knowledge is really some of the most comprehensive I've ever encountered. I love engaging with you, and it's been some time just to kind of get your sense of how things are rolling out and what's going on. And I know there's been a lot of things that have happened since we've spoken last. But I want to just kind of turn the microphone over to you to kind of give an entry point into what's happening in your neck of the woods and some of your focus and some of your prioritization, and kind of drive us through it, and then we'll just kind of see where the dialogue goes. Start.
For sure. I know this is crazy times. People would not believe a year or two ago you could not convince anyone that what's happening today was even possible. But it is. So it forces us to try to make sense of it. And that's forced me to do a lot of historical work. And it came through your work in the con. It came through my sense of the criminality of what I was looking into leads me towards William K. Black and your work with the con, when we get into the real depth of how a giant crime happens. And that was light bulbs. That's what I'm seeing here in Alberta, in the oil industry, the beating heart of imperialism. And that an incredible chase through history following the money. How did we get here? How are foreigners stealing the vast majority of every barrel coming out of the ground? And it turns out that leads into the crisis. But trying to make sense of today, it really helps to have the historical grounding of the competing forces. And I'm a political economist, which means I follow the money, but without ignoring the politics and history, the dynamics that's ignored by modern day economists who can't do math, who don't study history, and are idiots. But when you trace things back, the first economist, the first guy that the jerks running things today, the economists that made this current fiction, they point Richard Cantillon as the first real economist. And that's really revealing because Richard Cantillon was an imperial banker from Ireland and France. He helped make the deal to trade Spanish slaves into North America in 1512 that led to the creation of the South Sea Company. And he was an insider trader of that first financial scandal. He made
Wow.
millions, faked his own death to escape justice and to ever return his ill-gotten gains, and lived on the down low for the rest of his life, and published what's considered the first act of true economics. It's a fascinating, incredibly insightful work of economics by a real banker who knew exactly how everything worked. And he divides the world into three classes, much like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx. Three classes of society really helped make sense of what was going on, except Richard Cantillon had a different three classes. He started out saying princes and landlords are the only people who are truly independent in the world. Everybody else works for them as employees or as entrepreneurs trying to take risks and drill up something new at the behest of the princes and landlords who own everything and dictate what comes. And that's really useful for understanding how the world really works, starting with that South Sea bubble and that first financial scandal. And it's a lot of the basis for the political revulsion to the British Empire that led to American independence 50 years later. The South Sea bubble and the criminality of that is no small part of what drove to try to create something of integrity, of separation, so we don't get robbed like that. And then, in
Can
addition
I
to
can
by
I intercept?
1770, the
Can I intercept for a second, or
yeah, sure.
interject? I apologize. So this is so cool that you start off with this because I wasn't aware of who this person was in context to actually being a catalyst to what really is the nature of what our collective sort of vision is, but what I've been incredibly in tune with for some time. But just this past week, for example, I've had some remarkable conversations with David K. Johnson, an amazing American journalist and a legal professor, law professor, I should say, but someone who knows Donald Trump and Donald Trump taxes as well as anybody in the business, for example. And the focus of that dialogue with him and William K. Black was literally this revelation of centuries old dynamics and sort of positioning and how the shadow power can monkey the gears of control for an outcome that obviously anybody not in that particular apparatus can't see or understand. And further, it's not taught in schools, right? Not to the level that we drill down on when we further do exploratory research, when we become literal scholars in the scenario because of the nature of the magnitude. Look, we're not young men, right? We've been doing these types of things for decades, and we've lived through now a global calamity that has not ended for the past 14 years. But I wanted to just kind of set the table in terms of context for the viewer out there. You know, what Regan is talking about is so incredibly important because you might be like, no, I don't really want a historical lesson. And I got to be honest with you, when I first started this out, many people used to try to approach me with things that were happening in, 14th century to the 17th century. And I thought I knew a lot about imperialism. I thought I knew a lot about the nature and the magnitude of, shall we say, smash and grab techniques, right? In terms of you invade a country, you make nice with one of their big time leaders, you get them to basically get their entire apparatus of their economy to trade in your currency, and then you can bankrupt them, and then you can take over their natural resources. I mean, that's ultimately imperialism, right? And that's exploitation, and that was taking place for the past 300 years. And to your point, of course, then it leads to the American Revolution, where the founders, and we know exactly who the founders were, but they did revolt from a standpoint of like, no, we're not going to play your game. We're going to create our own game. Then we ended up becoming imperialist ourselves. And there was a sort of jocularity really throughout the evolution of the United States that has always been struggling with this reality. So I'll turn it back to you, but it's incredible because it is one significant continuum. And if you don't have a grasp of where it came from, there's no way you can see the forest for the trees.
It circles back to your point. This never ended. You're talking about the 2000 financial scandal. It never ended. It's still ongoing. The same imperialism never ended. You're not allowed to talk about it anymore, but at a certain point, the British king, he'd conquered 40% of the surface of the earth. And he assumes ownership of every resource under the ground. The oil, the gold, the silver, everything you can imagine is the personal property of the king and whoever he gives it to. And so, just like Richard Cantillon described in 1730, they're the only free people. They're sitting on the world's collateral. All the resources, any development will be taking those free things out of the ground, turning them into something useful and cashing in. You started with something free. The king stole all that. That is the Western world. And the king was overthrown in Britain. That was the first glimpse of political democracy. You'll see all the first seeds of the American dream, the American idea of fair governance and jury trial. You'll see in the British Civil War in the 1640s. By 1649, the levelers, what we would see today as political science, that's the first democratic movement. That's real citizens, workers, the vast majority realizing they're getting screwed and murdered. They need something. They need the rule of law. They need freedom of religion. And in 1649, on January 20th, The oppressed people of Britain made a declaration to all the landlords who were going to cut down the forests and said, this is can't stand, we need democracy. A couple months later, the most terrifying thing in imperial history happened. Monarchicide. They killed the king in Britain. The monarchy fell. They had a democratic experiment. Cromwell came in. He's a Puritan fundamentalist, authoritarian dictator. He dies, his son takes over, it falls apart, the king is restored. British monarchy by by the 60s has been reinstated. The 1660s, the king is back in charge. First thing he does, he sends Prince Rupert, the first royal family to go overseas, sends him to Canada to conquer Canada. The king's back in charge, and we need a piggy bank of free goodies. And that is when the whole history of banking changed. There was always bankers. They're always in league with the kings and the landlords. They could always use their free stuff to print new money, to do new things and repay, but you could only borrow based on real long-term collateral, real things the bankers could seize. It's a one-to-one relation. It doesn't allow for growth, or whatever growth there is in a society is captured by the bankers and landlords. That's why there was no progress. But the threat of democracy meant this imperial class needs something else. It needs a secret weapon against the rabble. It needs an advantage, and that was always going to be resources and finance. And as far as I can tell, the first loan ever given for speculative collateral is St. Rupert's Land, the Charter for Rupert's Land. The vast majority of Canada, all of our oil and everything was given to Prince Rupert, a privateer in the 1600s, and it was given out as given out as collateral a couple of times. While they were developing and exploring Canada, they'd actually secretly discovered the oil. The South Sea bubble was a distraction. And the first economist, Richard Cantillon, first appearance of him, he's a very secretive 007 kind of guy, aliases in and out of history. First time he appears is in Spain to negotiate the treaty for slaves for the South Sea Company that he later inside trades. But he's doing all this while Canada and St. Rupert's Land and oil is being cooked in the other way. So while this big game for the South Sea bubble and slaves to Louisiana scoops up everybody, is a trick to destroy France. They destroyed their enemies. Britain unloaded all of its state debt onto the South Sea Company, and then when it went bankrupt, all their debt disappeared. The British Crown was reinvigorated with liquidity, and it used that liquidity to buy their way into India and start an empire there. But these financial crimes are central to Western society. The South Sea bubble in the 1700s, that's the creation of economists. It's also the creation of newspapers. There weren't any newspapers in 1700. By the time the South Sea bubble comes, there's dozens of them. And they're full of propagandists selling this idea, luring everybody in. And in 1720, whatever legitimacy it might have had went totally corrupt. They bought off everybody blatantly, and everything went totally corrupt, and all the insiders cashed out. At the same time, it was the first bubble. They were getting every Tom, Dick, and Harry sucker in the world to buy into the bubble. They all got screwed. France got screwed. It was led to revolution by the 1840s, and again by the 1870s. It was a huge imperial maneuver by Britain. The South Sea bubble squandered.
Can I please insert this real quick? So I'm inspired by what you're saying, because you know that I'm a producer and I love pop culture and I love television and film and all of those things to use as metaphors, particularly. But I love them because it's what I do, and I love to. It's just what I've done for decades, right? And so one of my top 3 favorite series, actually, 2 of them are relevant. No, 3 of them are relevant here. Okay, so first, Game of Thrones. Second, Peaky Blinders. Third, Breaking Bad. All of the elements of all of those storylines are very applicable to what you're talking about. But I want to zero in primarily on Game of Thrones. So there was a character by the name of Bronn. Bronn, if you may recall from Game of Thrones, if you've watched that, do you know who I'm talking about? Who Bronn is?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So he says there was a moment, I think, in season 6 where there was kind of a feel-good moment because of some momentum by the guys that were doing good that would ultimately sweep in both the Lannisters, right? And they were on the side of good for a moment, right? And it was right towards the end, where they were going to have the battle against obviously the army of the dead. And what happened was that Cersei had, because Bronn was always a man for hire. Ultimately, he wasn't born of noble stock, and he gives this speech as he's got a bow and arrow pointed at both the Lannister brothers, and he basically says, "Look, the entire story of everything is how your parents in their fancy clothes stole from everybody else, and this is just never-ending game of everybody stealing, and then the hierarchy that creates these paradigms. So this pattern that you're talking about for people that might be lost in translation is like, no, reality is stranger than fiction. But I thought, for people that might just be tuning in for the first time, that might be useful because my God, that's what I continue to see all the time. The only thing that changes, humanity doesn't change. The power structure doesn't change. It's just the technology and the psychology used to amplify in much larger proportion now in a way that is the same sort of grift that's been going on for centuries. Please continue.
It's always facilitated by new technologies. Sources is what pays for these financial pulses of Britain getting into India, U.S. 1898. They went to gold and silver as the basis of the U.S. dollar in the late 1800s. That's what financed the Pacific Northwest and the expansion, and technologies like newspapers. That's a potent force of propaganda, especially when it's new. You don't even know they're all lying to you, and they're all kind of on the inside, and they're all kind of the first time you were. And so I have a graduate degree in political science, but those 3 TV series you mentioned, I learn infinitely more about political science from those series than you can from the university. And because of themes, and the reason it's such a mystery today is Adam Smith was the first kind of imperial twist. He was in all this. He worked with all these ideas, and he pondered them all without ever mentioning Richard Cantillon. And he changed the classes into sort of a fallacy, and he said labor was the only. I was wrong. And so Adam Smith kind of sent us on this wrong path, that it still had the rentier class, the bankers and imperialists, but within 50 years, by the late 1800s, that's disappeared from our economics, from our understanding. So we don't even know that there's these rentiers that killed everybody and stole all the stuff, and that's why they get all this iron for free for steel, and that's where their real money comes from, and the way that it's translated through the banks and that financial system. Because still today, you go to university across the Western world, without exception, every single university will lie to you about how banks work. You just need to stop for a second and just appreciate that fact of what that means. That there's no place of higher learning in the Western world that could just be honest and tell you how do banks work. You can ask any economist, any professor at any university, how do banks work? And they'll tell you a fairy tale. They don't know. You're not allowed to talk about it. They don't exist. Banks don't exist in their economic models and all their complicated stuff. They don't have banks. And so that's the missing piece. But if you see these forces, this class of society, characterized by the fact the law does not apply to them. They're the kings and their friends. The law doesn't apply to them. And so when we see this today, there's these weirdos. How do they get away with it? And then why don't the newspapers get them? It's so obvious. And you can talk to the journalists. You can give them the story. And they take it back to their yellow newspapers with their yellow editors who have real journalism. Is the rarest of history, an absolute essential resource to democracy, to education, but it's very rare. It exists for even within a journal for a little bit of time, for a little bit of places, but that's why yellow journalism, yellow economists, and the rentiers and the bankers, the same. And a friend of mine, a fellow Canadian researcher, has done some really interesting research I think you looked at that shows the continuity of these ideas and jargon through time.
If you don't mind, just to kind of intersect, I want to react to this real quick as well. And by the way, just to let you know, you have a little bit of a slight fluctuation with your feed. So every once in a while, you kind of unfortunately fits and starts. And so I'm missing about maybe 5% of what you're saying. So I don't know if, while I'm talking, if you want to just check your adjustment levels real quick, but I can always hit pause too, and then we can connect. So just tell me what you want to do. But I want to react to what you just said. That's so incredibly important because this has been, again, the sort of crystallization in my mind of how things work, right? So again, truth is not subjective. I know a lot of people like to think of truth as something that, it's something of faith. It's something of, it's out there that, nothing is ever completely concrete. And therefore, there's ways that younger people, for example, without the wisdom of life and being around the block and having experienced things and the challenges of things that we all have to go through as we evolve in our life's journey, that they're missing is that no, the entire legal system is framed on truth. It's truth of who did what, when, and how, if you can prove it, because of what we're talking about. Because the power has always lived under the guise of absolute power corrupts absolutely. And as I frequently cite, the 17th century French philosopher Bastiat, he said, when a group of men discover plunder, they create a legal code to authorize it. And like you said, media, a moral code to glorify it. Now, interestingly enough, and I love the fact that you studied political science and you've got a graduate degree in political science. That's what I studied undergrad. And I also studied journalism. But then I went right into Hollywood to pursue my, American dream. But what that did to me was it put me I was a small fish in a big pond. So I was like an executive assistant in the system, learning how the whole process works of developing big time movies and how it works and gets financed and all of the different players that are involved. So I got to see the entire sausage from a front row level, right? Because I worked for some of the biggest executive producers in the industry. And most of the time, they were idiots. They were complete morons that had a system of complete smoke and mirrors where they would use leverage all the time to control everybody in the pipeline for a specific outcome that was fed into the studio system, for example. What do I mean by that? So, for example, we're all familiar with Weinstein now, right? Weinstein followed a very similar pattern as did P. Diddy. P. Diddy, of course, being developed in that sort of construct. Then you'd learn when you widen the aperture, oh, wait a second, Epstein was doing the exact same thing on a very massive global, geopolitical construct that is still unfolding, even though obviously Epstein, either committed suicide or was murdered or whatever the case was back in 2019 during the first Bush administration. But we're now finally seeing, and I happen to have these interviews recently with the guys at the New York Times responsible. The United States' paper of record is telling certain elements of the story that to me were natural questions 15 years ago. And they're asking questions now because apparently, according to this gentleman, I have a great deal of respect for this editor, and I'm working with him on developing other things. So I've got to be very to the cuff about how important that, this relationship is. But I did ask him point blank. I said, why are you guys asking this question now? And he kind of did a dance. And it was like, well, we've been doing it the whole time. And I kind of take offense to that. But it's like I had to look at all the little pieces and take a big picture step back to put it all together to create the narrative that, but you and I both know there's an appetite and a green light because of all things anti-Trump at the moment to be able to finally ask those questions, right? Yeah. Because it might be able to take Trump down. That's his Achilles heel with MAGA potentially, right? But anyway, your point about this consurgence in yellow journalism, and I've been many, many, many times to the great castle, Hearst Castle in San Simeon. And William Randolph Hearst was the ultimate yellow journalist. He got us into the war in Cuba and that created all sorts of semantics at that time period. And I used to kind of, in a weird way, think that was kind of admirable in some strange ways when I was younger, not knowing the full story that I've had to be force-fed over the course of the last several decades because of what has drawn us together, the collapse of 2008 and so forth, right? And it's amazing, and I will add this. The density of the American populace, right, is this. Nobody cares about anything until it happens to them. And then it's suddenly pants on fire, the sky is falling, somebody please pay attention to me. Now all of a sudden we're in a situation, right, where because of Doge, because of USAID, which is going to literally lead to the deaths of millions of people. A lot of people want to, roll it into it's a CIA enterprise, this and that, which there's probably elements of that. But at the same time, there's AIDS, medication that would, prevent the deaths of millions of people in Africa, for example, right? But then we've seen now people stuck in airports on the tarmac for 4 hours at a time because of the air traffic control scenario, because of all of these, incredible, government shutdown and everything else. So the point that I'm trying to make is nobody cares about something unless it happens to them. And then it's like, oh my God, I'm inconvenienced. Oh my God, now my life savings is gone. Oh my God, I've lost everything. Somebody, why didn't that happen? But it didn't happen because of what we're talking about over centuries. They're Machiavellian players within the power apparatus that I learned long ago will do anything to dance for the power because they're complicitous, duplicitous, treacherous, thieving liars that control the power in the shadows. And yes, it's a conspiracy. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's centuries of power. And this is how the dynamics of all of these things work. And now suddenly I've allowed you to get up to what? Basically the American Revolution, but yet there's so much now. I'm going to try to be quiet, but you got me so enthusiastic about trying to paint color of some of these things that you've endeavored. But I want to kind of give it back to you from the standpoint that, look, everything that we're trying to do with the Clean New Deal, the new untouchables, and everything I've done with the con is literally, it's just like everybody's a liar in media. Everybody's a liar in power. And that we've seen it over and over. And millions of Americans are still looking to people that have been approved by the system, whether it's Bernie Sanders or AOC to a degree, and now Zoran Mondani, and they're good people, don't get me wrong. But none of them are attacking the corruption even remotely close to what we're doing in this situation. And if there's anything I want you to think about as we process this stuff, especially with you being up in Canada, is this nature of the truth is something that affects the entire world. And if we, people of good conscience and liberty, and those who believe in justice and integrity, do not compositely understand the methodologies of deception, we're doomed to the same outcome as millions of people have experienced throughout. Most recently, World War II, from a standpoint of 71 million people. Go ahead.
That is exactly this relationship, this imperial relationship between Canada and the United States is not a matter of the rest of the world to ignore. The Americans have their hands on more than enough carbon to end organized life on this planet. There's nothing standing in between the Americans and all the oil in Alberta to put an end to everything else. And so this is the issue. Reveal about how things actually work and how that enables us to solve what the actual problem is. Part of my argument is even more hopeful because I don't think it's quite fair to blame the American people for what they may or may not be perceived not want because of that reality we've both come to learn the hard way. I went to journalism school before I did my undergrad. A lot of time, and I live in a colony. So I've learned the hard way at every level without exception across the board how yellow journalism can be. And because of that, it's not quite fair to blame people for what they don't know about. And the whole system is organized preventing them from ever understanding. And a part of what makes this possible over and over throughout history is ignorance. 500 years ago, that was easy. There was no way to get out of ignorance. Ignorance is the root with which the imperial powers know how to work. They know how to divide and conquer. They know how to stir hatred. They know how to work things up. And they always did that wonderfully. They still do that today through media. That's what is doing a lot of this. So it is actually hopeful. And the actual unyellow, as unwelcome as it is, There's so many examples that it is possible. It certainly isn't easy. It doesn't last long. There's no quick, easy place to find the real answers to any of this, but it is out there. And once you get a grasp of the con, of understanding how things work, everything unfolding in the morning's newspaper starts to make a lot more. All of the BS, because I'm a political scientist, but you will notice you've never heard imperialism. I live in Canada. I've been a radical critic of the oil industry, of American foreign policy. I've never come across any discussion of Canada as a colony. Maybe Americans, billion barrels of oil up there in northern Alberta, never come across it, never heard a discussion of it, not aware of any scholarship. It's just a hole. And it's that taboo. That's the kink in the armor. That's the dragon with no scale. They can't defend themselves like that. It's incredibly hopeful.
I got to respond to that real quick. Because I was so cool, because I was thinking of J.R.R. Tolkien. I was thinking of that as a metaphor when you just rolled that out, of the dragon with the freaking hole in it. Yes, exactly. Please continue.
And to understand, with that proper understanding, Paul King and his friends, who the law doesn't apply to them, and there's everybody else. And so hundreds of years later, when we get into democracy, that means something very realistic that can expose all of this at every moment. Every imperialist, every imperial thing they do can magically be exposed by a simple understanding of the class dynamics of society. There's the king and his friends who own everything, the banking. There's employees who do as they're told and behave and get a living out of it. And there's entrepreneurs, the folks who aren't satisfied with that, don't have a regular income, take some risks, but it's all within the context of the financial system and the collateral of the other class. And so those entrepreneurs, those are the capitalists. They're not actually the problem. The outside of financial games, that's the only real way of dynamism and growth and new things, creative destruction, is those entrepreneurs. So you have the workers and then entrepreneurs. Those are decent people. It's a good society. They can follow the law. You could have, there's no one with them. They could partake in democracy in good faith. They could pursue their interests honestly, within the rule of law, transparently, accountably. There'd be differences, different ideas. We wouldn't have anything figured out. Different people, there would be clashes, but that could work. The kink in the problem is this residue from feudal times. It's this imperial class. The law doesn't apply to them, and they own everything. They decide what gets the surplus. That class of people, they cannot participate in democracy in good faith. They can't be honest about anything ever. They can't tell you what they're doing, why they're doing it. It's incompatible with the public interest, with the other 99% of society. Their interest, their goals, what they pursue, cannot be done in a democracy in good faith, cannot be done honestly, cannot be done transparently. There cannot be accountability for that class within a democracy. And so by the 1900s, when the first roots of political democracy were taking place, when ignorance has been subsided through the popular media and the printed word and international ideas, the growing awareness of the working class and industrialization, creating new, huge surpluses that could be captured and equitably distributed and managed in the public interest, that's a problem for this class. They cannot participate honestly. And that's when imperialism went underground. You can't say that word anymore. Bankers, what's that? Who's a banker? There's no such thing. We finance universities and economists for the first time after First World War. Economists become academics for the first time, but they don't know what money is and they don't know what bankers is. And they teach everybody to ignore those. And today they fund think tanks. They think talking heads on media. They all lie constantly. The most amazing mind bending. You can't even wrap your head around the lies, because it's bad faith. pursuing elite interests that are incompatible with democracy. So if they're lying, they're imperialists working against the public interest. You see it everywhere all the time. That's what's going on.
3 times. I keep putting myself on mute, and thank you for that. I want you're absolutely inspiring me on so many levels today. What a brilliant setup! Because again, I have to insert this here because it just dovetails into a lot of discussions I've had lately with the New Untouchables, ladies and gentlemen, that you can see at the newuntouchables.com, which is probably the premier, shall we say, resistance that literally has the tools that can turn the tables on this monstrosity of what we're in the midst of, if only millions of people understood it. But we're in that process of developing that. But I want to address something that Regan had just brilliantly digested, and I think it plays into, the reality on the ground, quite frankly, of Alberta, and Canada being, basically engulfed in American imperialism. So too is the South, my friend, recently of the United States. So basically, June Carbone, who I hold in the highest degree, has recently furthered this notion that I continue to understand of why MAGA had such a, shall we say, an imprimatur with the white supremacy and all things, let's just say, what it is, which throughout the South we've seen over the course of really my entire lifetime, a religious theocracy, right? There's this patriarchy that controls the masses for a specific outcome that is baked into this corporate class, but that evolved from that plantation model, which of course was again the nature of its own aristocracy, of course. And and I have a Quentin Tarantino approach to it, like Django. If you've ever seen Django, it's actually ruthless and brutal, and all of the revelations of how this thing comes. And by the way, it developed a degree of resiliency by the African Americans in the South that I think are unquestionable throughout the world. I mean, there are people that come out of the South that are African Americans that, whether gifted athletically or, of course, like the Reverend Martin Luther King and the Southern, Leadership Conference and that sort of thing, these people have a deep understanding, right, of the Jim Crow contortions of this incredible authoritarianism. And let's not forget that Adolf Hitler had studied Jim Crow. That's where he came up with the Nuremberg laws, was Jim Crow, right? So if it inspired Adolf Hitler, you can conceive that this is really not on the right side of history, right? And yet here they are again. And I just want to further this in terms of a corporate sort of analogy, because it's the same thing, okay? So Walmart, one of the largest corporations in the United States and the world, its business model is, of course, the cheapest products that come in and basically like I'm trying to think of like when a contagion of some sort of amoeba that comes in and then just grows and grows until it can't be stopped. It takes over small communities. It drives out all potential business. It controls through its managerial class the suppression of wages. And the only way people that are managerial in the process that can actually get bonuses and move up the actual corporate system is to destroy everybody that works there, right? To control them, to enslave them, so to speak. And there is no fairness of security. There is no ability to, create a living lifestyle. And yet they're subsidized by the government, right? They're subsidized in a socialist sort of way. And that's a mechanics that we haven't talked about yet. Not only do they have absolute control, but through the tax portals and through the economic sort of paradigm, what we've discovered, particularly through Federal Reserve Act 13.3, and I wonder if you can carry this forward specifically as it relates to Alberta and commoditization of oil and future forward financing, right, is that this game is played of complete exploitation through imperialism to smash and grab, to complete control with complicit actors in the situation that serve the masters at the behest of everybody else. But here's the thing. It's guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the United States. That's the ultimate trick that we haven't seen throughout history, even though it's probably been played out in different ways. But since 2009, we've never seen it at this level that's never ended. We're talking tens of trillions of dollars to this criminal class right before our eyes, playing all of the same games that we've talked about forever. And now we're seeing media consolidation in a way that we've never, I mean, we've seen it for the last 20 years, but now it's even on overdrive. It's the end. Unless somehow the truths that you and I are talking about somehow blast through to the people to get their awareness level up to where they actually become activated, to where they can pull off the rose-colored glasses like the movie They Live, or put them on in this case, to see what's actually happening to them, which is literally the destruction of everything that we were taught to believe we are. Please continue.
There are a number of major turning points in Western history, and we are in the middle of the last one of them. The same game is coming to a head because we're in the twilight of the globe's capacity to absorb this. And so the same game and logic that has been driving 300 years, these same forces, they get paid in their sleep for nothing. They killed everybody, stole their stuff, and they get paid the rest of their life in their sleep for nothing. And it's this class of people that has done battle with the rest of citizens in a democracy that has characterized Western history. And what we're seeing today is the end game. And the imperial class's answer for those entire 350 years since the English Civil War was finance and oil. This pool of free collateral. You kill some Indians on top, you have $1 billion of free collateral money you can print into the air, dictate, etc. That's what started in the 1600s. That's Canada. That's colonizing before there was an America. That's British and imperial. That's the international class. That's the German king and the Russian king and the British king. They're all thinking the same way. They're all cooperating. Their answer to the monarchicide in 1649 is terrifying that oil finance was the answer, and it slowly cooked and come. The first thing the British reached for was oil and finance in the 1600s. By the 1800s, when the U.S. is under growing democratic pressure, labor awareness, by World War I, my latest work is focusing on this period, and the argument is the war against democracy was won before World War I. And the crowning achievement of that was Federal Reserve Act 13.3. Of 1913, on the eve of World War I, the ability to create money is taken out of the federal government's hand and placed in the control of private bankers through the Federal Reserve Act. And there's a secret imperial clause buried in there, 13.3, that allows them to print unlimited amounts of money. Especially if you were going to be an imperialist and you were going to steal $1 billion over here, it could be laundered through 13.3 of the Federal Reserve. Before World War I started, all of the oil in Alberta, which was officially discovered in 1715, before the bubble really took steam, they've known it's there the whole time. It's been planned for development since 1888, and by 1910, the British had secretly written the colonial regulations that allowed it to be sold secretly to some American controllers. So all that oil in northern Alberta by 1910 was sitting with the British imperialist new friends, the American oilmen. And they were going to have that. And through 13.3, they could launder unlimited amounts of money to shape world future, dominate. And that's what they wanted to do. So in 1935, using a radio Bible thumping evangelist, they installed a government in Alberta. Except he was the acting premier of Alberta, and he placed it into receivership. And then on one of the Magna Carta anniversaries, and that control all of our oil, staff our regulator, are above the law. Canadian law does not apply to them. They don't have to justify anything. They're free. Black letter law, Quisling installed by the Americans, they have complete control of Alberta, enough to end organized life. By the 1950s, the biggest bank in America. By 1900, the thick bitumen and double the world's oil reserves in one moment. In 1959, the approval of the Canadian government, the Alberta government, the U.S. government, the Department of Energy, the U.S. military, bomb in Alberta. They just announced it. There was no debate, nothing. Luckily, the Canadian Prime Minister was a real patriot of a rare sort, a lawyer from Calgary who knew the score and was able to thwart that first attempt to financialize trillions of dollars of Alberta oil onto Wall Street. Was thwarted in 1959. The Kennedy administration got rid of him in the next election to install their friend Pearson in Canada, and things got back on track. But at the end of the day, back in 1913, that seed was planted that the private bankers had the unlimited power to print money. And if you combine that with an overseas empire, you're not allowed to talk about it. You won't find anything more than the most radical dissidents saying the word, let alone studying it seriously. But that's the secret to American success. Using foreign collateral to print American dollars, to dictate where and when development happens. And that's this wonderful solution. If you can understand what's going on, thanks to the Kahn and William K. Black, then the solution is, if we're not giving these imperial jerks $71 trillion, there's nothing we can't do. If there was the rule of law, if there was democracy, then our problems can all be solved. It can all be funded. The only problem is there's this imperial class that's above the law, and you're not allowed to talk about them. And so when you turn on the TV, even the most radical dissident critics, all they can tell you is they're stupid. They're stupid. Why? They're doing something so stupid. They're just stupid. No, that's not what's happening. And if that's all you can say, then you're part of the problem. If you can't say the obvious, like like Patrick does, you see a crime, you call it. It's just whether you like it or not, that's what it is. If they can't do that, they're the side of the imperial coin. You have the bald-faced, good faith imperialists that just hatred, brute force, not apologetic. The other side of the coin is the liberals. They'll say nice things to you in bad faith, but they're imperialists. They support all those things, always have, always will. They'll say nice things about groups, but when it comes down to it, the liberals are bad faith imperialists, and the right wings are the good faith imperialists. And if that's the only debate you're allowed to have, you'll be endlessly confused. And that's part of the trick of media. It isn't true they can't tell the truth. And that's part of the mind that messes with your mind. They can be honest, but only after it's too late. So that'll really mess you up. They will say honest things after it's too late, after nothing can be done about it. And then later they'll go back and they point to that. It doesn't all the time. They were lying, leading, feeding it, serving it in every way, every syllable, every headline, serve that. Once it's too late, we can be honest. And that's where we get confused. I spent my whole journalism career finding those pieces, those amazing insights. You go find those journalists, they're not doing it anymore. It's just this one blip. It happens once, and it's never spoken of again. That's weird that wouldn't happen in real journalism. All the best stories disappear like they never happened because it's all yellow. But those are the credibility. I went to journalism school in the 90s. Watergate. That's the only thing that's the FBI told them stories and they wrote it down. And that's the greatest journalism of all. The journalism is. They kept it all secret. But like, last point with that's, it's a yellow journalism, everything in focus. And if you find people like you and the other people you work with, some of them only do it some of the time because they work for yellow editors. And it's only moments of opportunity to get little things like this in. And they got to kind of, but it's amazing you're still working with them. One should realize all the pressures they're under, them to do whatever they can get away with. It's our job to create the space. This is on tab. It's a giant crime, but if you don't talk about it, it's going to continue. But it's precarious. could all come down with a little bit of democracy.
Can I please respond? I did it again. I'm so sorry. This is such a fantastic conversation, and I apologize to the viewer for the max headroom kind of like delays in our connection here. We're getting through it, and I hope you have the patience to get through it because, Regan, everything you're saying is so powerful and it's so on the money, and I have to just respond to it in the moment because it just really further develops why I have been as tenacious as I am. First and foremost, I have to say this proclamation, and I'm sick and tired of it, and I got to somehow pinprick whoever's watching this out here, and you've got to understand your role in this. You got to like and subscribe and share. I'm sorry. That's how we beat the algo. That's how it's got to morph, man. It's just got to be contagion out there. The truth has got to basically overwhelm this darkness of depravity and these tricks of deception that when you put a lot of money into it and everybody's working for the situation, like I addressed the No Kings rally, back in October, and I said I'd like to think of myself as Upton Sinclair, in the pursuit of the truth from a standpoint of being a renegade, gonzo journalist in this sense, because the nature of what Upton taught us was when you get somebody's ideology or perspective to depend on their paycheck, then you can control them all day, which is exactly what Regan is talking about. But further to that, in terms of the moment, right? I always say that all the American people buy, and I could say most of the world, all we buy are lies. Because what I always say, Regan, is that most people are condemned to the four walls of their existence, right? They have to pursue some sort of life that has them tethered to something, to where, whether their mortgage, their car, their children, everything is dependent on their income, right? And so you're trapped, right? You don't have time to explore the truth because you're living your own reality. Now, there comes a time where suddenly your paycheck's at risk. You realize that you played this game too long. Everything, like if you're in the military and you're a four-star general in the United States, you can have your entire career clipped by this idiot Pete Hegseth, which is happening in the Department of Defense right now. I guess my message to that is complicity in evil is going to blow up in your face. Sorry, you gambled wrong. If you don't have truth on your side, if you don't have liberty and justice on your side, if your actions aren't in alignment with your ideals, you're living in disarray. And that's what we're seeing all over the world. That's what we've seen for now decades. And if you can't get right with the truth, which we established at the beginning here, that isn't subjective. We're not talking about your faith in God. We're not talking about whether you feel spiritually that if you do certain things that you're going to have certain. I mean, those are things that belong. They're important. You can do whatever your life's journey, drives you forward. But in the real world, we have to depend on the law. The easiest way to look at it is if you want a building to stand upright, it has to be built with an integrity of a structure that follows certain paths and regulations of engineering and architecture that people much smarter than myself went to years of school to master. And then, they go through the process and it becomes their livelihood. And we have to depend on them to get it right for us to actually trust that that structure is going to stand, or the plane's going to fly, or the ship's going to float, or the computer's going to work, or the lights are going to work. I mean, guys, this is something you should know by the time you're in fourth grade intuitively, right? But yet we go through our journey, we don't see the forest for the trees, and then suddenly it's like like it did to me, the roof caves in, right? Suddenly your whole life is in disarray because you don't have an income, because you can't support your family, because you got set up in something much bigger than yourself. And the first thing that happens to you is you blame yourself. You're like, oh, I did something wrong. I didn't know what I did. Maybe I didn't understand this, that, and the other. I took risks that I shouldn't have done. And then suddenly you're like, okay, you're their pawn. And that was kind of the situation that I was in until I became enlightened, because I became enlightened to the tricks of the trade that no, you're just a commodity. You're just basically a number on somebody else's, books where you're expendable. And what I continue to tell people, and I have since the very beginning of my journey, is I'm not expendable. I guarantee you, Regan Boychuck to his family is not expendable. And I would like to think that anybody who has any sort of self-respect and self-reliance would think of themselves as not expendable. So you have to become a citizen, which means you have to be informed. You have to be involved. No, I like sports as much as the next guy. I meet guys all the time that know more about sports. They're an encyclopedia of knowledge about sports in every category, which means they've got the capacity to function, but they have no idea what's going on this geopolitical juggernaut of deception by these lying, thieving, deceiving con artists that control the power structure. And I'm thinking to myself, why? You have the capacity. You're just not looking in the right place, which brings up the metaphor of my favorite film of all time, Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. When Indy was in competition with the Nazis to find the Lost Ark, he ended up with a staff of Ra that had both sides of the information to tell him exactly where the Ark of the Covenant was. What that is, as a metaphor, is it's called asymmetric information. The power can lie to you. Anybody from the 70s remember Pink Floyd's We Don't Need No Education in The Wall? That taught us that from the very beginning, right? You're indoctrinated. You can be controlled. You can be manipulated. You can be forced through the grinder to be something that the system wants you to be. Of course, the great comedian George Carlin told us you'd have to be asleep to believe the American dream because of all of these different scenarios that he laid out that I know millions of us are aware of. But here's the situation, Regan, and I want you to take us home from here because I want to talk about your reaction to the new Untouchables and the Clean New Deal in context to what you're going through. And I'd like you to tell us what you're going through too, because I know you're going through some challenges at the moment, and I wonder if it's relevant to all of these types of situations, because I assume it is. Everybody's kind of under this just juggernaut. But the nature, folks, of Doge, the government shutdown, what's happening with the corruption. Donald Trump has backdoored $5 billion plus into his own pocket since he's taken the presidency. I believe he stole the presidency with all of the powers that be, and nobody stopped him. And this while literally cutting off the assistance to 42 million people, food sustenance, right? There is no better expression of what Reagan is painting the picture of than this. I like to call him Don McCon Rico Pedo Pig sitting on the golden throne of corruption, because our Supreme Court essentially knighted him a king. The biggest idiot con job in the history of the United States is in control. And what are you doing about it, right? So anyway, I was up on my pedestal there, my soapbox, but I know you know all of it and then some. But please go where you feel comfortable, man. I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, that's the dilemma of this current moment. Really can't find the ground. Nothing makes sense. Nothing is adding up. Is also when we most desperately need the sort of answers that are embodied in the Clean New Deal and the new Untouchables. Regular people are in no position to discover that. They've already been working to the bone. By the time things are getting to the point of collapse, everybody is maxed out. They have even less capacity than they ever had to make sense of any of this. And the media is still doing everything to hype it, to feed it, to take us up and up towards this crash. So people can be forgiven for not believing in it, but the pressures are enormous. And it's the things like the Clean New Deal and the new Untouchables, that's what people are grasping for. That this has been ongoing for 14 years. This is the team that saw it 14 years ago. That did the bud 24 years ago. That's the team. That's what people are looking for. That's the essential service offered to the Americans. What's missing in this, like the sort of crisis that led up to World War I, there was a lot less ignorance. Maybe it was a mix. There's plenty of ignorance for one, but there's enormous education and class awareness with the democratic agitation. Same sort of thing in the 1930s. The Great Depression, massive economic challenges, war. But that was probably the high water mark or the low water mark ending democratic journalism. At that crisis before World War II, was at a low ebb. As we approach World War III, ignorance is peaking after a lot of effort of the class line of education. Ignorance is higher, making us more vulnerable. Peak ignorance and the drop, and the game is over. Globally, this game, sustainability, planet is at its end. There's no more need for the masks, no need to pretend. And that's what we're seeing. And it's really hard to accept. But at the end, kill whoever I want and just keeps executing people. The message is the president can do whatever he wants and he'll execute whoever he wants in the world. That's the real message. That's the real message every other government in the world gets. That's what they understand. And whatever fiction we believed about international order, the United Nations, it's done. It's over. That's what the war in Gaza means. The International Court of Justice going, that's the anyone, anywhere, any way we like, over and over. And I run our mouths about whatever, but the message is their action and what it done as a student of international relations. If they've repudiated the United Nations, every organ of it, every collective decision making, every sort of check on the aggression that led to World War II is gone. It's over. And places like Canada that are literal colonies of the United States. In 1940, 100,000 American troops amassed on the border, and we invited the Prime Minister alone to come sign a permanent treaty subjugating Canada. And it's censored. You're not allowed to talk about it. It's hard to find about. But the Ogdensburg Treaty was signed, permanently subjugating us. That's why you get to steal our stuff and nobody even says anything. That's what has enabled all of this. So today, as we barrel towards World War III, as the world reaches its environmental limits, as the financial crimes peak, the political idiocy off the charts, ignorance is, there is no organization, there's no infrastructure, there isn't the organizations of workers and Canadians like there was 100 years ago or before World War II. The Clean New Deal is the remnants of that public interest, of the people, the citizens who believe the hype, who pursue the hype, because it's right and it works and we see it and it's been used and it could work again. And the crimes are of such a scale that it solves our other problems. Politics is, how do you pay for it? That's no longer a problem. The problem is, how do we get the king out of our business? And I'm here in an American colony with the boot on our neck, the cost of mortgages, the cost of home insurance, the cost of groceries is utterly amazing. And there's no culprits. There's no one to blame. Everybody is drained of their money monthly to insurance companies, mortgage companies, and we're struggling to keep our heads above. And now's the time we need to figure out what's going on. We need to do some studying, to get to with our neighbors. We need to, but we can't. And we're barreling to, that's the dilemma we're in, is the key to making sense of this. This is not a new thing. It is dire, but we're not too stupid. Stuff is not my. What this all circles back to today is the financial nature of imperialism. That's what's been operating underneath. That's the driving force, and it's the new untouchables are the only people in history that have ever understood those financial crimes and successfully prosecuted them. And we're chomping at the bit in 2008 to do the same thing again, but for some inexplicable reason, stupidity, I suppose, they were prevented. And it's continued for 14 years. It's been put on overdrive today, but understanding those financial crimes, prosecuting those financial crimes is the only thing we need to solve all of our problems, to take the imperial class out of the equation, to put all this money, that collateral, that's the free gift of nature. That's just the stuff underneath your farm. It belongs to the public, should be developed in the public interest, and the free surplus that comes from it should be wielded in the public interest, rationally within boundaries, but it's extremely hopeful that the nature of the crimes you reveal and the team you have assembled chomping at the bit once again to do what they did once before, because it's either that or a Mad Max future on the planet. Those are the only choices, and everyone on Earth should be desperately concerned with this relationship between America and Canada, because somebody somewhere has to step in or it's all over.
Wow, boy, did you come in clear and beautiful on that. Thank you. God, that was so powerful. I'm going to offer my conclusion as well. So first and foremost, I just want the audience to understand that, you know, I don't know Reagan inside and out like I might know somebody I've known for 20 years, but I've grown very, very allied with all things Reagan over the course of the last several years, as a matter of fact, because we've just been engaged in this dialogue and growing and fruitful and all of these things. And I've discovered just how much talent he has in the position of his training and his education has allowed to this point of his life. But I also want to point out that he's a father to 6 children. He's a roofer. He faces challenges just like everybody else in the real world. And hopefully we're going to get past that at some point. Hopefully we're going to be able to build something that people find, I think, worthwhile to subscribe to downstream. We haven't come up with the model yet, but hopefully we'll get there. But we're building the plane and flying it at the same time, Reagan. But I want to pick up on some of the points you just made really throughout, and I want to kind of insert a lot of the pop culture references so that I think people can understand them very clearly, right? So first and foremost, because I am a product of the 70s and I grew up in the 80s, and I grew up understanding all things Contragate and all of the things that would lead to compelling you to write Bullet, the Blue Sky, and all of those sorts of geopolitical manufacturings of all of the elements of what would lead to ultimately Epstein, if you want to know the truth. And Warren Zevon was just inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And one of his greatest songs was Lawyers, Guns, and Money. And ultimately that undergirds what I think everything that you've just laid out, Reagan, that transmits the last 300 years of history. Right equals might, ultimately, is what we're talking about here. And ideology does matter, my friends, from a standpoint, if you don't have a vision and your actions aren't aligned with that vision, then you can't create an outcome that, for example, we all pledged allegiance to in the United States for liberty and justice for all. Otherwise, it's a lie. Now, to further use a couple of pop culture references to help paint the fresco, as it were, I was reminded, and I am reminded constantly, of the 3 characters that I prefaced earlier. That include, well, I should say the 3 television series, and I really appreciated Reagan's comment that, with his PhD and I guess his master's in political science master. Okay, there you go. That you've learned as much about power from those 3 fictional depictions of power than you might have through, years and years of, academic excellence, and which is amazing to put those things together. And I'd say I have too, right? That's useful because it's easy for popular culture to get it, because we know millions and millions of people have seen these series that I'm prefacing. So the 3 that I think are useful are, of course, Peaky Blinders and the protagonist Thomas Shelby. In Breaking Bad, it was Walter White, and in Game of Thrones, I mean, there was a lot of them that I could choose, but I'm going to stick with Jon Snow at the moment to close us out of here, right? So in the Peaky Blinders story, what was really amazing to me was Thomas Shelby comes from this gypsy family where really what made him the rock that he became was his job during World War I was to dig tunnels underneath the enemy's feet to sabotage them. And that was literally digging in the trenches in the most horrific trench warfare in the history of the world, right? And that was the thing that enabled him, as he gets through this litany of scenarios, being a bootstrap lad that he was, right, with all things against him, being gypsy and all of these other elements that did not fit into the aristocracy paradigm of that period of England. But he was an entrepreneur, and he was, basically grifting in the shadow sector and a very ruthless gang, of course, that they called the Peaky Blinders. And it's his family and all of the goings on that would lead him to understand that he would ultimately run for office. He ran for office basically as a socialist. And as a job as a socialist at that time, it was interesting because here he is as this ruthless capitalist entrepreneur, if you want to call it that, right? And all of those decisions that he had to make, though. But he was really a social democrat, honestly. And he believed in this sort of, in the hierarchy of the board. He gave the women of the company equal votes, and he was very thoughtful to the African Americans in his community and so on and so forth. There wasn't a sort of, shall we say, well, again, the white supremacy, and of course in the southern United States, like this Christo-fascist sort of paradigm. He was antithetical to that, right? But it was because literally because he was digging in the trenches every day, and who was going to intimidate somebody after going through that experience, right? He'd been around the block, and he learned, and he kept to grow, and he cultivated to the point where he's playing ball with Winston Churchill and all of those things that manifested from there. So I'm going to set that analogy aside for a moment. In the case of Walter White, I don't want to kind of, do a whole dissertation on what Breaking Bad was all about. But in essence, it was this, chemistry professor that lost his health care because of cutbacks, because of all sorts of Doge-related sort of scenarios where he had all of this skill, and he had to go to the free market to basically protect his family and his life. So he ended up, becoming an entrepreneur to sell, blue crystal meth, right? And then he becomes this sort of mythical character where he was unstoppable, and he was like the deliverer of all things evil because he could take out anybody, right? Great story in so much of overcoming that which dealt him a bad hand. Okay, but there's synergy here between, of course, Thomas Shelby and Walter White. Now, further to that, when you consider Jon Snow evolution, of course, we learned at the end, for those of you who are connoisseurs of the Game of Thrones, that he was always the king, right? I mean, that was his place, but he didn't know that. He was the bastard. And all he really cared about was the existential threat of the army of the dead. Use that as a metaphor. What is the existential threat? Well, it's all of these things that Reagan and I have been talking about. It's, the planet can't sustain this outlay of fossil fuel, even though there's a lot of things we could talk about that geopolitically on what Alberta should recoup and many other things if we were able to turn the tables on this monstrosity of this fossil fuel paradigm that's got complete control, financial fossil fuel paradigm of our current reality. They're just doubling down on the world that came after World War II and really everything that bred itself before that. But staying with the theme of the moment, he had to overcome the existential threat with the powers that be to ultimately sustain humanity. Was really everything is ridiculous in the face of the army of the dead. So everything is ridiculous in the face of a corporate fascist aristocracy that uses poison to, a baseline of fossil fuels to basically poison the world. Now, are 99% is everybody going to die as a result of this? No, probably 90% of us, right? I mean, I don't know what the end game is. We know that the billionaires are building bunkers in places like Zuckerberg and Maui, and everybody's favorite. I'd like to call him a welfare queen. Elon Musk, of course, has just got $1 trillion incentive package, and everything that goes with that. But the point that I think we can conclude with here, people, whether it's a fictional depiction or your understanding of several hundred years of reality that's created the world that we live in, these patterns repeat themselves over and over and over, because at the end of the day, it's truly about power. And what we're trying to invigorate you with is to be emboldened, to be empowered with the truth. And the truth is how this system operates to steal from you when you still have a tiny degree of liberty and agency to be able to conform around a movement that's going to put the people who know how to deal with the situation, and as Reagan has exemplified, the people in the new untouchables have literally put thousands and thousands of white collar executives in prison that were responsible of billions of dollars of theft that have led to millions of people's lives being demolished, ruined, or lead to death, right? We're talking about significant things. Now, I just want to put one final bow on this, just so you can kind of get the perspective here, folks. So, yes, it is very important to be enthusiastic and excited about last Tuesday's blue wave in the United States, right? It's incredible that California passed Prop 50 and what that means in the playing field. It's really important that the Democratic Supreme Court justices in Pennsylvania were able to maintain their positions given the billionaire $1 million onslaught campaign to remove them. Obviously, most people were fixated on Zohran Mamdani, and Zohran Mamdani, as June Carbone illustrated yesterday, has really put a big kerfuffle on the billionaire control, as if like he's some sort of communist threat. I mean, he's talking about free transportation for working class people. He's talking about, state-run grocery stores to maintain prices. He's talking about, rent control in a city that's out of control because of all of the financial goings on of what we show you in our work, The Con, that you cannot see for free anymore because that's gotten pulled by the powers that be because of other influences that I haven't made you aware of, Reagan, that need to get the truth on the shelf because, of course, if the people don't understand it, then obviously they can control it that much further, right? And but the point is that because we did the work in The Con, which gets us to the Clean New Deal, we've been able to amass this group of really superheroes who have done this before, who know what they're doing. They have a plan in play that I laid out after No Kings, where we're going to get whistleblower testimony into state legislatures to work around the NDAs, to get subpoenas to basically bring down the Trump administration, and also to expose liars in the Department of Justice who will, if there is any integrity left of the American Bar Association, will have no choice but to revoke the bar licenses of those that are lying clearly from the Department of Justice, lying for Donald Trump. And again, in the end, he's the emperor's new clothes on really bad acid because he's so pathetically transparent in his corruption. He's not even a capable criminal. The guy's a fool. He's such a pedestrian idiot. It astounds the conscience to know this guy has been able to be put into a position and given complete control of, let's say, the United States nuclear arsenal, which at the end, to your point, Reagan, if you think it's terrifying that we can blow Venezuelan probably fishing boats out of the water and condemn them to a death sentence without having any inclination of who these are, and this is against all international law, it's against all American law, it's against constitutional law, and yet nobody's stopping him. Again, not to put too fine a point on it, while he's gotten away with at least $5 billion from sources that they claimed. You remember right during the No Kings, they claimed that if you support No Kings, you support Hamas. He just let CZ, the CEO of the largest trading outfit for called Binance, which is crypto exchanges, where all of the supporters of Hamas have been exchanging and laundering money for I don't know how long. So everything this Trump administration does is a projection of what they do, is what I'm trying to say. Everything is a lie. Everything is distorted. And it's all to destroy you. And if you don't rise to the moment to try to grasp of what Reagan and I are saying, there's no hope for you. There's no hope for the country. There's no hope for the world. Everything is literally on the line. That's all I have to say. What do you have to say?
I think what's resonating through all your comments is that there's dark clouds on the horizon. We can all see them. It's big. It's the biggest we've ever seen. But one of the silver linings of those incredible war financial crises is they produce great people. A lot of people die, but the ones that make it through that maze to come out at the end, that's the silver lining. Those are the people that understood enough to make a difference. Those are the people we can learn from. Those are the people we have to build on. That's who William K. Black is. He was thrown into the first round of this in the 70s and 80s, and against odds that would make us blush today, he was successful. And the 2008 financial crisis produced Patrick, who was just dumb enough and just earnest enough to pursue the truth in good faith farther than anyone else, to put the pieces together no matter what. That's one of the results of, and those are the silver linings that are littered across history that point us to the ideas and the principles that have defeated this, can still defeat it. And that's why it's as ugly as it's ever been. But Patrick and I don't quit, and we're not going to, because we know, and it's only a taboo, and it's precarious. And if people smarten up, then there's very few limits to what we can still accomplish.
Thank you for existing in the world, my friend. I appreciate your tenacity, your honesty, and your pursuit of justice alongside us. And I deeply, deeply appreciate it. So, all the best to you and your family. Please keep me up to speed on what's happening this week. Thanks for the dialogue. Everybody out there, please check out thenewuntouchables.com. Please check out thecleannewdeal.org. And I'm going to put, a list of articles. Please send me what you think is the most relevant. I'll put in in the description links to some of more Reagan stuff, and look forward to more of our discussions moving forward. Reagan, thank you, and all the best to you up north, my friend. Take care.
Take care.